The Dakota Territory stretched endlessly under a pewter sky, its prairie grasses bending before October winds that carried the promise of a harsh winter. In this vast emptiness, where the horizon seemed to swallow the world whole, stood a modest ranch house that had once echoed with dreams and laughter. Now it held only silence. Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan stood at her kitchen window, watching the cattle graze in the distance while her coffee grew cold in her hands. At 34, she was still a handsome woman, with auburn hair that caught the light and green eyes that had once sparkled with hope. But the prairie had a way of weathering people, and 10 years of loneliness had carved lines around her eyes that spoke of sorrows too deep for tears. The townspeople of Cedar Falls, 20 miles south, had their own name for her, the barren woman. They spoke it with a mixture of pity and judgment, as if her inability to bear children was both a tragedy and a moral failing. Maggie had stopped going to town 3 years ago, tired of the whispered conversations and sympathetic looks that felt more like accusations. Her husband, Patrick, had died in a blizzard 7 winters past, leaving her with a ranch she couldn't properly maintain, and an emptiness that seemed to grow larger each year. The other ranchers had offered to buy her land, some with genuine kindness, others with barely concealed greed. But Maggie had refused them all. This was the home Patrick had built for the family they'd planned to have, and leaving it would feel like betraying not just his memory, but the dreams they'd shared. She'd tried. God knew she'd tried. For 5 years of marriage, she and Patrick had hoped, prayed, and suffered through disappointment after disappointment. The doctor in Rapid City had finally delivered the verdict with clinical detachment. Some women simply weren't meant to bear children. He'd offered no explanation, no cure, just the cold finality of medical science. The kitchen clock chimed 6, jolting Maggie from her reverie. She had evening chores to finish before darkness fell, cattle to check, chickens to secure, doors to bar against the night and all its dangers. Dakota Territory was still frontier country in 1883. Despite the railroad and the growing settlements, wolves roamed the northern ranges, and bands of coyotes grew bolder as winter approached, hunting in coordinated packs that could bring down anything smaller than a full-grown steer. As if summoned by her thoughts, a distant howl drifted across the prairie, long, mournful, and entirely too close to her ranch. Maggie set down her coffee and reached for the Winchester rifle that never left her side. Living alone had taught her to be cautious, to prepare for dangers that came with sunset. She'd learned to shoot, to fix broken fence posts, to deliver calves and tend sick cattle. Independence had been thrust upon her by circumstance, but she'd embraced it with the stubbornness that had kept her alive and sane. Another howl answered the first, then another. The pack was gathering, and they were close. Maggie stepped onto her front porch, rifle in hand, and scanned the darkening prairie. The cattle were bunched together in the near pasture, their heads raised in alarm. They sensed the predators circling in the gathering dusk. A movement caught her eye, something small and dark moving across the open ground between her house and the barn. At first she thought it might be a calf that had strayed from the herd, but as the figure drew closer, she realized it was human. A child. Maggie's heart lurched. What was a child doing out here alone, with night falling and coyotes on the hunt? The figure stumbled, fell, got up again, with the determined movements of someone running on pure will. As it came closer, Maggie could see it was a girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, wearing a torn dress and clutching something in her hand. Behind the girl, shadows moved in the tall grass, low, swift shapes that flowed across the ground like deadly smoke. The coyotes had found easier prey than cattle. Here, Maggie shouted, chambering around in her rifle. Run toward the porch. The girl's head snapped up at the sound of her voice, and she veered toward the ranch house with renewed desperation. But the coyotes were faster, cutting off her path with the practiced coordination of experienced hunters. Maggie raised her rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed across the prairie, but the coyotes barely paused. They were hungry, committed to their hunt, and one woman with a gun was just another obstacle to overcome. The lead coyote, a grizzled male with one torn ear, broke into a lope that would bring him to the girl in seconds. The others followed, their pale eyes gleaming in the twilight, but the girl wasn't done fighting. As the lead coyote closed the distance, she whirled around and raised the object in her hand, a broken fence post, sharp on one end. Her voice cut through the evening air like a battle cry. "Get back! Get back!" She swung the makeshift spear at the charging coyote, catching him across the snout with enough force to make him yelp and stumble. The other coyotes hesitated, confused by this small prey that fought back with such ferocity. Maggie used their hesitation to her advantage, firing another shot. This one aimed closer to the pack. The bullet kicked up dirt just inches from the lead coyote, and the sharp whine of the ricochet finally convinced them that this hunt wasn't worth the risk. The pack melted away into the darkness, leaving only their frustrated howls echoing across the prairie. The girl stood in the middle of Maggie's yard, still clutching her fence post, her small chest heaving with exhaustion and adrenaline. Her dress was little more than rags, her feet bare and bleeding, her hair a tangled mass of dark curls. But her eyes blazed with the kind of fierce determination that Maggie recognized, because she'd seen it in her own mirror every morning for the past 7 years. "Are you hurt?" Maggie called, stepping down from the porch but keeping her rifle ready. The girl shook her head, though she swayed on her feet as the adrenaline began to fade. "What's your name, child?" "Lucy," the girl said, her voice hoarse from running and shouting. "Lucy Harper. Well, Lucy Harper, you just saved my life. Those coyotes had me pinned on this porch until you drew them off." It wasn't entirely true. Maggie could have held them off with her rifle, but the girl had shown extraordinary courage, and courage deserved recognition. Lucy straightened slightly at the praise. "You saved mine too, ma'am. That rifle shot scared them good." Maggie smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in months. "I suppose we saved each other then. Come inside, child. You look like you haven't eaten in days." As Lucy walked toward the porch on unsteady legs, Maggie found herself studying the girl's face in the lamplight streaming from her windows. There was something familiar about her features, the shape of her nose, the set of her jaw, but she couldn't place where she might have seen this child before. "Lucy," she said gently, "where do you come from?" "Where are your parents?" The girl's expression closed off slightly, the wariness returning to her eyes. "Don't have parents, Mom." "Haven't for a long time. Then who's been caring for you?" Lucy was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that no child should have to bear. "I care for myself, ma'am. And for the others." "Others?" But Lucy had already stepped onto the porch, and Maggie could see the exhaustion overtaking her small frame. Questions could wait until morning. For now, it was enough that the lonely ranch house would have a voice other than her own, echoing through its rooms. For now, it was enough that someone needed her. As Maggie guided Lucy into the warm kitchen and began preparing food, she felt something stirring in her chest that she'd almost forgotten, the simple joy of caring for another person. She had no idea that this was just the beginning, that by morning, her entire world would change in ways she never could have imagined. The kitchen filled with the warm aromas of beef stew and fresh biscuits as Maggie bustled around her stove, stealing glances at the small girl who sat at her wooden table. Lucy had accepted a bar of soap and a basin of warm water to wash with, revealing a face that was striking despite her obvious hardships. Her dark hair, once cleaned and combed, fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her brown eyes held an intelligence that seemed far older than her years. "How old are you, Lucy?" Maggie asked, ladling stew into a bowl. 12, I think," Lucy replied, attacking the food with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned not to waste opportunities to eat. "Maybe 13. Hard to keep track sometimes." Maggie set down a plate of biscuits and took the seat across from her unexpected guest. "You think? Don't you know your birthday?" Lucy paused with a spoonful halfway to her mouth. My mama used to sing to me on a day in spring when the wildflowers came up. April, maybe May, but she's been gone 4 years now, and I stopped counting after that. The casual way she spoke of such loss made Maggie's heart clench. What happened to your parents, child? Fever took Mama first, Lucy said matter-of-factly. Papa lasted another winter, but he was never the same after she died. Just faded away, I guess. Left me and the others at the mission school in Deadwood. The others? Lucy's eyes met hers across the table. My brothers and sisters. Well, not blood brothers and sisters, but we became family at the mission. When it closed down last month, we all stayed together. Maggie felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. How many children are we talking about, Lucy? 4 besides me. There were more, but some got taken by families passing through, and some— Lucy's voice trailed off. Some didn't make it through the hard times. The matter-of-fact way this child spoke of death and abandonment broke something in Maggie's chest. She reached across the table and covered Lucy's small hand with her own. Where are they now? These 4 others? Lucy tensed slightly, as if she'd revealed more than she'd intended. Safe, she said carefully. I make sure they're safe. But where, Lucy? It's October. Winter's coming fast. Children need shelter, regular meals, warm clothes. I take care of them, Lucy said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. I've been doing it for months. We get by. Maggie studied the girl's face, seeing the pride and fierce protectiveness that had driven her to take on responsibilities no child should bear. It reminded her painfully of herself at that age, forced to grow up too quickly when her own parents died in a railroad accident. I'm sure you do take care of them, Maggie said gently. But caring for 4 other children all by yourself, that's a heavy burden for anyone, let alone someone your age. Lucy's jaw set stubbornly. We don't need charity, Mom. We're not beggars. Of course you're not. Maggie recognized the pride speaking, the same pride that had kept her isolated on this ranch for years, rather than accept pity from well-meaning neighbors. But everyone needs help sometimes, even grown-ups. As if to prove her point, a gust of wind rattled the windows, reminding them both of the approaching winter. Lucy glanced toward the sound, and for just a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the frightened child beneath. Tell me about them, Maggie said softly. Your family. Lucy was quiet for a long moment, then began to speak in the careful cadence of someone reciting precious memories. There's Tommy. He's 8, and he's good with numbers. Real good. Can add sums in his head faster than most adults. His parents died in a mine collapse. She paused, taking a sip of the hot milk Maggie had poured for her. Then there's Sarah and Emma, the twins. They're 6, and they don't talk much, not since their folks died of cholera. But they understand everything you say to them. And the 4th? Lucy's face softened. Little Ben. He's only 4, doesn't remember much from before the mission. His mama just left him there one day and never came back. He calls me Mama sometimes. The word hung in the air between them, and Maggie felt something twist in her chest. This child, barely more than a baby herself, had become a mother to 4 younger children, taking on responsibilities that would challenge a grown woman. Lucy, Maggie said carefully, where exactly are you keeping these children? It's been below freezing at night, and it's only going to get colder. Lucy's defenses went up again. We have shelter. We're not sleeping in the open. But what kind of shelter? Lucy was quiet for so long that Maggie thought she might not answer. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, There's an old sod house about 5 miles north of here. Roof's mostly gone, but we fixed it up with canvas and branches. It's not much, but it keeps the worst of the weather out. Maggie closed her eyes, imagining 5 children huddled in a partially collapsed sod house, trying to stay warm with whatever scraps they could find. The image was almost unbearable. Lucy, that's not going to be enough when the real winter storms hit. You know that, don't you? The girl's facade finally crumbled. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, her small shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. I know, she whispered. I know it's not enough, but I don't know what else to do. I promised them I'd keep them together. I promised them I wouldn't let anyone separate us, and I don't. I don't know how to keep that promise when winter comes. Maggie was around the table in an instant, gathering the sobbing child into her arms. Lucy resisted for a moment, then collapsed against her, crying with the abandon of someone who'd been carrying the world on her shoulders for too long. "Shh," Maggie murmured, stroking the girl's dark hair. "It's going to be all right. We'll figure something out. You don't understand," Lucy sobbed. "They depend on me. If I fail them, if I can't protect them, you won't fail them," Maggie said firmly. "Because you're not alone anymore." Lucy pulled back to look at her, hope and skepticism warring in her tear-stained face. "What do you mean?" Maggie took a deep breath, making a decision that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "I mean that tomorrow. We're going to bring your family here. All of them." Lucy's eyes widened. "Yeah, but you don't even know them. They're not your responsibility." Maggie smiled, feeling something shift inside her chest, a wall that had been built of loneliness and disappointment beginning to crack. "No," she said quietly, "but maybe they could be." That night, Lucy slept in Maggie's spare room, the room that had once been intended as a nursery, with its hand-carved cradle and carefully sewn curtains. As Maggie listened to the girl's steady breathing through the thin wall, she found herself lying awake for the first time in years. Not from loneliness, but from anticipation. Tomorrow, she would meet 4 more children who needed what she had to offer. Tomorrow, her empty house might finally become a home. Dawn came gray and cold to the Dakota prairie, with frost painting the windows and the promise of snow in the heavy clouds overhead. Maggie woke before sunrise, as was her habit, but for the first time in years, she wasn't alone with her thoughts and coffee. Lucy was already awake, standing at the kitchen window and staring north toward the horizon with an expression of barely contained anxiety. "They'll be worried," the girl said without turning around. "I told them I'd be back by midnight. They'll think something happened to me." Maggie poured 2 cups of coffee, adding extra milk and sugar to Lucy's. "Then we'd best get an early start. How far did you say it was to this sod house?" 5 miles, maybe 6. Lucy accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her small hands around the warm cup. "But it's rough country. No proper roads, just game trails and creek beds." Maggie nodded, already mentally preparing for the journey. She hitched her strongest horse, Buck, to the wagon and loaded it with supplies: blankets, food, medical kit, extra clothing. Whatever condition these children were living in, she suspected they'd need immediate attention. The ride north took them through country that grew increasingly wild and desolate. Here the railroad and telegraph lines hadn't yet reached, and the land remained as it had been for thousands of years: rolling prairie, dotted with stands of cottonwood trees and bisected by meandering creeks that would freeze solid within the month. Lucy directed their path with the confidence of someone who'd traveled these routes many times, pointing out landmarks that would be invisible to most eyes: a distinctive rock formation, a lightning-struck tree, a bend in a nearly dry creek bed. "There," she said finally, pointing toward what looked like a low hill covered with prairie grass. "That's it." As they drew closer, Maggie could see that what she'd taken for a natural hill was actually a man-made structure, a sod house built into the side of a slope, its walls made of stacked earth bricks, and its roof a patchwork of canvas, branches, and salvaged boards. It looked like the home of creatures rather than children. Before the wagon had come to a complete stop, Lucy was jumping down and running toward the structure. "Tommy!" "Sarah, Emma," she called. "It's me! I'm back." The response was immediate. A section of canvas that served as a door was pulled aside, and children began emerging from the sod house like prairie dogs from their burrow. Maggie's breath caught in her throat at the sight of them. The boy, Tommy, she assumed was thin as a rail, his clothes hanging loose on his small frame. But his eyes were alert and intelligent, and he moved with the careful precision of someone older than his 8 years. The twins were harder to distinguish from each other, both pale and fragile-looking, with blonde hair that might once have been carefully tended but was now tangled and dull. They clung to each other with the instinctive closeness of children. who'd learned that they could only depend on each other, but it was the smallest, one that broke Maggie's heart completely. Little Ben couldn't have weighed more than 30 pounds. His clothes so patched and repatched that their original colour was impossible to determine. He launched himself at Lucy with a cry of "Mama, Mama!" that carried across the prairie like a bird's call. Lucy caught him and swung him up into her arms, her face radiant with relief and joy. The other children crowded around her, all talking at once, their questions and concerns tumbling over each other. "We thought the coyotes got you. Tommy said you'd come back, but it was so late. Did you find food? Are there people who might help us?" Lucy's eyes met Maggie's over the heads of the children, and Maggie saw the weight of responsibility settle back onto the girl's shoulders, like a familiar burden. "There's someone I want you to meet," Lucy said, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone making an important introduction. "This is Mrs. O'Sullivan. She might be able to help us." 4 pairs of eyes turned to study Maggie with the wary assessment of children who'd learned to be cautious around adults. She climbed down from the wagon slowly, not wanting to startle them. "Hello," she said simply. "Lucy's told me a lot about all of you." Tommy, as the oldest boy, stepped forward slightly, not quite protective but ready to be if necessary. "Ma'am," he said politely, "Lucy said she was going to look for help, but we didn't expect—" He trailed off, clearly unsure how to finish the sentence. "You didn't expect a stranger to actually care," Maggie finished gently. "I understand that. You've learned to depend on yourselves, and that's made you strong. But winter's coming, and sometimes even the strongest people need help." She gestured toward the sod house, its makeshift roof already sagging under the weight of the frost that had accumulated overnight. "May I see your home?" The children exchanged glances, then Lucy nodded. "It's not much," she said apologetically. The interior of the sod house was both better and worse than Maggie had imagined. Better because it was clear that Lucy had worked tirelessly to make it livable. The earthen floor was swept clean. Their few possessions were organized neatly, and a small fire pit had been dug with careful attention to ventilation. Worse because despite Lucy's efforts, it was still a hole in the ground that would become a death trap once the Dakota winter arrived in earnest. But what struck Maggie most was the evidence of family that filled the small space. Drawings scratched into the dirt walls, clearly the work of the twins. A collection of smooth stones arranged with mathematical precision, Tommy's contribution. A tiny nest of grass and soft materials where little Ben obviously slept. Positioned closest to where Lucy's bedroll lay, these children had made a home out of nothing, held together by love and the fierce determination of a 12-year-old girl who refused to let them be separated. "You've done an amazing job," Maggie said, and meant it. But Lucy's right, this won't be enough when the snow comes. The children's faces fell, and she saw the fear creep back into their eyes. "However," she continued quickly, "I have a ranch house with more rooms than I know what to do with. And a terrible problem." Tommy's head tilted slightly, his mathematical mind clearly working. "What kind of problem, ma'am?" Maggie smiled. "I'm the loneliest woman in Dakota Territory, and my house is so quiet I can hear myself think. It's driving me slowly mad." Little Ben giggled, the first sound of pure joy Maggie had heard from any of them. "I was wondering," she continued, "if perhaps 5 children might be willing to help me solve that problem. The pay would be room and board, warm clothes, regular meals, and all the education I can provide. The work would be helping with ranch chores, keeping me company, and making enough noise to convince me I haven't gone completely deaf." The silence that followed was profound. The children stared at her as if she'd just offered them the moon and stars. Finally, Tommy found his voice. You want all of us? Together? I can't imagine wanting you any other way," Maggie replied. "From what Lucy's told me, you're a family. Families belong together." Lucy stepped forward, still holding little Ben, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Are you sure, ma'am?" "We're not. We don't have anything to offer you. No money, no fancy clothes, no—" "Lucy," Maggie interrupted gently. "You saved my life last night. You showed more courage facing those coyotes than most grown men would have. And you've kept your family together through hardships that would have broken most adults." She looked around at all 5 faces. Young, wary, but beginning to hope. "Trust me when I say that I'm getting the better end of this bargain." The twins exchanged a look. Then Sarah, or perhaps Emma, stepped forward and slipped her small hand into Maggie's. It was answer enough. As they loaded the children's few possessions into the wagon, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She'd spent 10 years believing that her inability to bear children meant she would never be a mother. Now, as 5 children climbed into her wagon and began the journey to their new home, she realized that sometimes the most precious gifts come in forms you never expected. Sometimes the family you're meant to have finds you in ways you never could have imagined. The first week was chaos. Not the destructive kind of chaos that comes from unruly children, but the overwhelming, joyful chaos of a house that had been silent for 7 years, suddenly filling with the sounds of life. Footsteps on the stairs, conversations at meals, laughter echoing from rooms that had stood empty for too long. Maggie had forgotten how much space children could occupy, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Every moment seemed to demand attention, consideration, decision-making. It was exhausting and exhilarating at the same time. Tommy had claimed the small room that had once been Patrick's study, drawn by the shelves of books and the writing desk, where he could work on the mathematical problems that fascinated him. He'd appointed himself the unofficial accountant of their new household, carefully tracking expenses and helping Maggie plan their budget for winter supplies. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said one morning over breakfast, "I've been calculating our food needs for the winter, and I think we should increase our order of flour by 20%. Growing children eat more than you might expect." The twins, Sarah and Emma, had begun to emerge from their shell of silence. Emma, it turned out, was the artist of the pair, covering every available surface with drawings of flowers, animals, and family scenes. Sarah was the practical one, drawn to the kitchen and the satisfying work of cooking and preserving food for winter. Little Ben followed Maggie everywhere, his small hand frequently slipping into hers, his vocabulary expanding daily as he absorbed the security of having adults who wouldn't disappear on him. And Lucy. Lucy was struggling with the transition more than any of them. For months, she'd been the sole adult in their makeshift family, making decisions, solving problems, carrying responsibilities that would have challenged someone twice her age. Now, suddenly those responsibilities had been lifted from her shoulders, and she didn't quite know how to be a child again. Maggie found her one evening sitting on the front porch, staring out at the prairie with the weight of the world still visible in her young face. "Penny for your thoughts," Maggie said, settling into the chair beside her. Lucy was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you ever wonder if you've made a mistake?" The question caught Maggie off guard. "What kind of mistake?" "Taking us in. 5 extra mouths to feed, 5 more people to worry about, 5 more chances for things to go wrong." Lucy's voice was barely above a whisper. "What if we're too much trouble? What if you get tired of us?" Maggie felt her heart break a little. "Oh, Lucy, is that what you've been worrying about?" "It's what always happens," Lucy said matter-of-factly. "Adults take us in because they feel sorry for us, but after a while we become burdens instead of blessings. People change their minds." "Some people do," Maggie acknowledged. "But I'm not some people." She reached over and took Lucy's hand in hers, surprised by how small it felt, despite everything this girl had accomplished. "Lucy, do you know what my life was like before you knocked on my door?" The girl shook her head. "I woke up every morning in silence. I ate breakfast alone, did my chores alone, went to bed alone. The only conversations I had were with my cattle and my chickens. I was so lonely, I sometimes talked to my reflection in the mirror just to hear a human voice." Lucy looked at her with surprise, as if it had never occurred to her that adults could be lonely too. "The townspeople called me the barren woman," Maggie continued, "as if my inability to have children was the only thing that mattered about me. As if I was broken, defective, less than whole. But you're not," Lucy said fiercely. "You're the kindest, strongest person I've ever met." Maggie smiled. "Thank you for saying that. But the point is, I believed them for a long time. I thought my empty arms meant I was meant to live an empty life." She gestured toward the house, where the warm glow of oil lamps illuminated windows that showed scenes of domestic happiness. Tommy bent over his books, the twins playing a quiet game, little Ben building castles with wooden blocks. Then you appeared in my yard, fighting off coyotes with nothing but a fence post and pure courage. You brought me your family, and suddenly my house was full of voices and laughter and the beautiful chaos of children who needed what I had to give." Lucy was quiet. "Processing this, Lucy," Maggie said gently. "You didn't just save me from those coyotes. You saved me from a life of believing I had nothing valuable to offer. You gave me the chance to be the mother I always dreamed of being, even though we're not really your children." "Aren't you?" Maggie asked. "Do I love you any less because I didn't give birth to you? Do you need my care any less because we don't share blood?" Lucy considered this, and slowly a smile began to spread across her face. "I guess not. Family isn't just about blood, Lucy. It's about choice. It's about people who choose to love each other, care for each other, stick together through good times and bad. By that definition, we became a family the moment you brought the others to my door." That night, as Maggie tucked each child into bed, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just 7 days. Her house was messier, her expenses were higher, her quiet routines had been completely disrupted. She had never been happier. The real test came 2 weeks later, when the first major storm of winter hit Dakota Territory, with a fury that reminded everyone why this was still considered frontier country. Snow fell for 3 days straight, driven by winds that howled across the prairie like living things. The temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows, and Maggie had to keep fires burning in 3 different rooms to maintain enough warmth for the children. If Lucy and her siblings had still been living in that sod house, they would have died. The knowledge of this hung unspoken in the air as the family huddled together in the main room, telling stories and playing games while the storm raged outside. But there was no fear in the children's faces now, only contentment, security, the blessed knowledge that they were safe and warm and together. On the 3rd night, as the wind finally began to die down, little Ben climbed into Maggie's lap and looked up at her with solemn eyes. "Mama Maggie," he said, the first time he'd called her that. "Are you our mama now? Forever and always?" Maggie looked around the room at Tommy, bent over his arithmetic, at the twins sharing a book by the firelight, at Lucy, finally relaxed enough to act like the child she still was. "Forever and always," she promised. And outside, the storm that could have killed them all finally blew itself out, leaving behind a world transformed by snow, clean, white, and beautiful, just like the family that had found each other in the most unexpected way, and discovered that love doesn't always follow the paths you expect. Sometimes it comes in the form of an orphaned girl with a fence post, fighting coyotes in your yard. Sometimes it comes with 4 other children who need exactly what you have to give. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the problems you thought you couldn't handle. Spring came to Dakota Territory with the sudden intensity of a miracle. One day the prairie was locked in winter's grip, and the next, green shoots were pushing through the melting snow, while meadowlarks sang from fence posts. The transformation was so swift and complete that it seemed almost impossible, until you remembered that this was the frontier, where impossible things happened with startling regularity. Maggie stood in her garden, watching Tommy and the twins plant the seeds they'd carefully ordered from the catalogue over the winter. Little Ben helped by carrying a toy shovel and making his own holes wherever the fancy struck him, while Lucy supervised the entire operation with the attention to detail of a seasoned farm manager. 6 months. It had been exactly 6 months since Lucy had appeared in her yard fighting coyotes, and the transformation in all their lives was almost as dramatic as the change from winter to spring. Tommy had grown 3 inches and gained 15 pounds, his sharp mind flourishing under Maggie's patient tutoring. He was working through mathematics problems that would challenge high school students and had announced his intention to become an engineer when he grew up. The twins had found their voices at last. Sarah had developed a passion for cooking that rivaled women twice her age, while Emma's drawings had evolved into detailed portraits and landscapes that covered the walls of their shared room. They still communicated with each other in their own silent language, but now they also spoke freely with the rest of the family. Little Ben, at 4 years old, had completely forgotten the trauma of his early abandonment. He called Maggie Mama without hesitation and referred to his siblings as if they'd always been together. His laughter had become the soundtrack of the house, a sound that Maggie had never realized she'd been missing until it filled every corner of her home. And Lucy had finally learned to be a child again. She still took her responsibilities seriously, helping with chores, looking after her younger siblings, but now she also played, laughed, and occasionally acted with the carefree abandon of someone her age. The weight had lifted from her shoulders, and in its place had grown something lighter, trust, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Tommy called from the garden. The soil temperature is optimal for corn planting. Should we start the rows now? Maggie smiled at his precise language. The boy couldn't just say, "It's warm enough." He had to give her a technical analysis. Go ahead, Tommy, but remember to space them 12 inches apart. Rows 3 feet wide, 1 inch deep, he recited. I know, I read it in the farming almanac. As the children worked in the garden, chattering and occasionally arguing over the best planting methods, a wagon appeared on the horizon, making its way up the long drive to the ranch house. Maggie shaded her eyes against the spring sun, trying to identify the visitors. As they drew closer, she recognized Reverend Thomas and his wife Martha from Cedar Falls, the first time anyone from town had visited since she'd taken in the children. Lucy noticed them too and moved protectively closer to Maggie. It's all right, Maggie said softly, placing a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. They're good people. But as the wagon pulled up, Maggie felt her own protective instincts rising. She'd spent 6 months building a family, creating a safe haven for these children. If anyone thought they could question her decisions or threaten what they'd built together, they would discover just how fierce a mother's love could be. Reverend Thomas climbed down from the wagon with a warm smile, his wife following with a basket covered by a checkered cloth. Mrs. O'Sullivan, he greeted her. I hope we're not intruding. We've been meaning to visit for some time. Reverend Martha, Maggie replied cautiously. What brings you all the way out here? Martha stepped forward, and Maggie noticed her eyes were bright with emotion. We heard about the children, she said simply. The whole town has heard. And we wanted to see if the rumors were true. Maggie felt her spine stiffen. What rumors would those be? That Margaret O'Sullivan, the woman everyone called Barren, had become mother to 5 orphaned children overnight, Reverend Thomas said. His voice was gentle, without judgment. That the loneliest ranch in Dakota Territory had become home to one of the most beautiful families we'd ever heard of. Maggie relaxed slightly. It's true. These are my children, all 5 of them. Martha's eyes filled with tears. May we meet them? Over the next hour, as the children shyly introduced themselves and showed the Reverend and his wife around the ranch, Maggie learned the real reason for their visit. The town feels terrible, Martha confided, as they sat on the porch while the children played in the yard. All those years we called you barren, treated your situation like a tragedy or a failure. We never stopped to think that maybe God had a different plan for you. A plan that required waiting, Reverend Thomas added, waiting for 5 specific children who needed exactly what you had to offer, and who could give you exactly what you needed. Maggie looked out at her children, and they were her children now, in every way that mattered, and felt a profound sense of rightness. "I spent 10 years angry at God," she admitted. "Angry that I couldn't have children the traditional way. Angry that Patrick died before we could adopt. Angry that the world judged me for something I couldn't control." "And now?" Martha asked gently. "Now I understand that some blessings require patience. That some families are built differently, but that doesn't make them any less real or precious." She smiled as little Ben tumbled in the grass, his laughter carrying across the prairie. "I wouldn't trade these children for anything in the world, not even for the biological children I once thought I wanted." Martha reached into her basket and pulled out an official-looking document. "We brought something for you. The town council met last week and we took a vote. We'd like to help you make this official. Adoption papers for all 5 children, if you're willing. And a fund we've established to help with their education and any unexpected expenses." Maggie stared at the papers, hardly able to believe what she was seeing. "The town wants to help?" "The town wants to make amends," Reverend Thomas corrected. "We judged you unfairly, Margaret. We defined you by what you lacked, instead of recognizing what you had to offer. These children have given us all a lesson in what really matters." That evening, after the Reverend and his wife had left with promises to return soon, Maggie gathered her children around the dinner table. The adoption papers lay in the center. "Official and imposing. I need to talk to all of you about something important," she began. 5 pairs of eyes focused on her with varying degrees of concern. "These papers," she continued, touching the documents gently, "would make our family legal in the eyes of the law. They would mean that you're officially my children, with all the rights and protections that brings. Like real children." Little Ben asked, his eyes wide. "You are real children," Maggie said firmly. "These papers just make it official for the government and the courts. But I won't sign them unless everyone agrees. This is a decision we all need to make together." Tommy spoke first, his voice steady and sure. "I think we should do it. Not because we need papers to be a family, we already are, but because it will protect us. Make sure we can't be separated." The twins nodded in agreement, and Lucy squeezed little Ben's hand. "What do you think, Lucy?" Maggie asked. "You've been their guardian for so long. How do you feel about officially sharing that role with me?" Lucy looked around the table at her siblings, then at Maggie. Her eyes were bright with tears, but her voice was strong. "I think," she said slowly, "that I've been trying to be something I wasn't ready to be. I tried to be their mother because I loved them and didn't want us to be separated. But the truth is, I was just a scared kid trying to keep us all alive." She stood and walked around the table to Maggie, taking both of her hands. "You've shown me what a real mother looks like. Someone who doesn't just provide food and shelter, but who teaches us, protects us, loves us unconditionally. Someone who makes us feel safe enough to be children again." Lucy's voice broke slightly, but she continued. "I'll always be their big sister, and I'll always love them. But I don't have to carry the weight of being their mother anymore, because you're our mother now. You have been from the moment you let us stay." Maggie pulled Lucy into a fierce hug, and soon all 5 children were wrapped around her. A tangle of arms and tears and overwhelming love. That night, Maggie signed the adoption papers by lamplight, her hand steady despite the tears streaming down her face. As she wrote her name, once for each child, she thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. She thought about the lonely woman she'd been, defined by what she lacked rather than what she could offer. She thought about a brave girl fighting coyotes in the darkness, protecting a stranger because it was the right thing to do. She thought about 4 other children who had learned to survive, but not yet how to truly live. And she thought about the family they had become, not through blood or biology, but through choice, courage, and the kind of love that transforms broken pieces into something whole and beautiful. The next morning, Maggie woke to the now familiar sound of children's voices and the smell of Sarah's cinnamon rolls baking in the kitchen. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where her family was already gathered around the breakfast table. "Good morning, Mama," they chorused, all 5 of them. speaking in unison, and Maggie realized that the word she'd once thought would be forever denied to her had become the sweetest sound she'd ever heard. She'd been called barren, as if that defined her worth, but now she was called Mama, and that defined her purpose. The town had been wrong about her. She hadn't been barren at all. She'd just been waiting for the right family to find her, waiting for 5 children who needed her as much as she needed them, waiting for a night when coyotes and courage would intersect to change all their lives forever. As spring bloomed across the Dakota prairie, the O'Sullivan family bloomed with it. 6 hearts that had been broken in different ways, now beating together as one.